Thank you, Brad, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name's George Lucas. No kidding, it really is. But I'm not that guy. I don't do Star Wars and imaginary robots. I work with real wars and real robots. And his bank account and his house are a little bit bigger than mine. I wanted to read you a few lines from Shakespeare's Henry V, pointing out to you while I did that, that play is required reading for cadets at the United States Military Academy, at the U.S. Naval Academy, where I teach, at the Air Force Academy, and a variety of other places as well. It captures, I think, some of the issues that we're reflecting on here. This is a famous scene. You'll remember having read this in high school, college, or perhaps recently if you're a fan. But it's when Henry gives the orders that the French prisoners should be killed. Two ordinary infantry captains come in the next scene after that order's been given, and they're commenting to each other on the significance of that order. One of the captains says, "Kill the boys and the luggage. 'Tis expressly against the law of arms. 'Tis as arrant a piece of knavery, mark you now, as can be offered. In your conscience now, is it not?" he asked the other. And the other captain responds, "'Tis certain there's not a boy now left alive." And the prisoners, he's sure they're already been put to the sword. "And the cowardly rascals that ran from the battle had done this slaughter." So the killing was done not by real soldiers, but by people who had run from the real battle and now were carrying out the king's order. "Wherefore most worthily the king hath caused every soldier to cut his prisoner's throat." And then this captain concludes caustically and bitterly, "Oh, 'tis a gallant king." Well, why read you that? It's 500 years old, but well before any Geneva Conventions or laws about which we're about to hear. But it shows not at the top levels of society, but amongst ordinary, probably peasants, soldiers, laypersons, a reflection on what one can and cannot or should not do in conducting armed conflict. Well, I was darn glad to have that passage ready to hand a few years ago when, in my capacity as chair of ethics at the Naval Academy and the postgraduate school, I was invited to give the Dunbar lectures at a small United Methodist liberal arts college, Millsaps College down in Jackson, Mississippi. And it was on precisely the topic of our discussions here. Emerging technologies, their impact on war, how it's changing the face of war, and whether it's putting all those traditional principles under assault. A philosophy professor who chaired the committee that invited me said, "I'd like you to sit and talk with this young man who's just back from Iraq." He was a young Marine enlisted who had served, not Iraq, but Afghanistan, 3 tours of duty early in the war, and was now studying at Millsaps. And I sat and talked with this young man for some time. He obviously was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And the substance of his concern, he was deeply angry at me. And he was deeply angry at me because he said, you and your rules and your laws, you are tying our hands behind our backs and you're getting us killed. And I labored to point out to him that, well, if you look at this piece of literature, you see those aren't my rules. I didn't make them. They're your rules. They reflect the highest ideals of your honorable profession when you're behaving honorably. They come from a discussion amongst people like those 2 ordinary soldiers and ordinary soldiers like you about what we think we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish, and what we are willing to do, and most importantly, what we're unwilling to do to get there. Not unlike physicians talking about health care or journalists talking about the limits of their profession. So my point is that these principles that we're discussing are under threat from military technology, and we need to wonder whether those fundamental intuitions, like those of those 2 captains in the infantry 500 years ago, have transformed under the impact of the technologies that we have to conduct war and the people who are using those technologies in things like cyber war and robotics and remotely piloted vehicles.
Thank you. Andrew.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Feedback, okay. First of all, I wanted to say thank you very much to the Chautauqua Institution for hosting us this week. It's been an incredible facility and an amazing venue for us to have this discussion. I also wanted to thank David Lincoln and the Lincoln Center for supporting us in this endeavor. My name is Andrew Carswell. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross. If you're not familiar with the breakdown of the various Red Cross and Red Crescent institutions, it might be valuable for me to give you 2 seconds on that. We, the ICRC, the International Committee, are the founding body of the International Red Cross. We're based in Geneva, Switzerland. And we used to be a largely Swiss body, but we're made up now of many different countries around the world. And our history goes back to the 1860s and a battle that took place there. And Mr. Henri Dunant, who was the founder of the Red Cross, if you're asking the question, where does the Red Cross come from, is actually the inverse of the Swiss flag. We became the guardians of international humanitarian law, which is the law of war or the law of armed conflict, as Brad was referring to, by virtue of the fact that Mr. Dunant instigated the first Geneva Convention in 1864. Today, we in fact have 4 Geneva Conventions, which were solidified in 1949 and forged in part by the Second World War, but had a lot of history before that as well. Now, the American Red Cross, of course, and National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies deal with other issues like disaster assistance. They deal with public health, and we're an offshoot of this starting point, which was armed conflict and other situations of violence, which is what we focus on. But we work very closely as a movement together, and those national societies of Red Crescent and Red Cross societies, which are 189 around the world, are actually gathered together by a federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, also in Geneva. So just it makes it a rather confusing picture, but all you need to remember for the purposes of today's discussion is that we're the ones who deal with armed conflict and violence. Now, we're about 12,000 of us worldwide and in about 80 countries. Now, I've been asked to come to speak to you this morning about international law generically and in very few minutes, and I'm also asked to speak to you about a couple specific areas of law. One is the law that governs the right of states to use force against each other in international relations. Another one is, which is completely separate, is the laws of armed conflict. So as Brad was referring to, a separate body of laws which is designed actually to mitigate the effects of armed conflict. But first I'll ask the question openly. What is international law? Well, we know international law primarily governs relations between states. We know that much. The question you might be asking, sitting where you are, is it effective? Is it useful? Does it have teeth? Well, I would suggest to you that international law has a very broad spectrum of instruments, and the question of effectivity depends on the self-interest of states who sign up onto treaties which form international law, and also by virtue of the custom created by their practice that also becomes binding customary law. So it's quite a complicated system, but is it effective? Well, let's take a look at postal relations on one end of the spectrum, or the Chicago Convention on Civil Aviation. The fact that you're able to fly over multiple countries at any given time is a function of that. The fact that you're able to mail a letter to the other side of this planet in a week is by virtue of postal relations that are international. International humanitarian law is at the very end of that spectrum, in the sense that we're talking here about states that might be on their last legs, states that are actually fighting for their very existence. So is it effective? Well, it's as effective as we make it. And in fact, my role within ICRC in dealing with armed forces is to try to integrate that law into the everyday practice of armed forces. But it's a much bigger picture than that, which I don't have time to get into right here. But I wanted to outline these bodies of law very quickly for you. So there's this law governing the use of force in international relations. That's called the United Nations Charter, as you're very aware, forged by the Second World War, but it goes back before that. In fact, it goes back to a number of very important people from American history, like Woodrow Wilson. It goes back to Mr. Kellogg of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was the first instrument which tried to ban the use of force in international relations in 1928. But anyway, it was all codified in 1945 in the UN Charter. So what is the UN Charter? Well, it's based on a fundamental premise, which is the prohibition on the use of force. The states are not allowed to resort to the use of force in their international relations. However, we can see that's not always successful. I think we opened the paper today. There are two exceptions to that. One is where the Security Council, this 15-member body that sits in New York, of which 5 are permanent members carrying vetoes, including the United States, that's an exception. If they authorize the use of force, then force can be carried out, and they can do so if there's a threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or an aggression, as identified by them as the Security Council. The second exception is self-defense. Self-defense not of any sort, but self-defense against an armed attack. And these are key words, armed attack. What is an armed attack? Because if we come back to what we're talking about today, is a stroke of the keyboard that leads to a cyber effect on the other side of the world, is that considered an armed attack to which another state could respond with force? These are open questions, and frankly not questions that the ICRC concerns itself with because they're inherently political questions. As you can see from what happened in the Security Council this week related to Syria, and the General Assembly was actually condemning the Security Council about its failure to act on Syria, which is very unusual. This is a highly political domain, and our job at Red Cross is actually to back up from that and to look solely at the humanitarian consequences of warfare, bearing in mind that wars do in fact take place. So let's move on to that body of law next. International humanitarian law, the law of war, the law of armed conflict, these are all the same thing. They're based in the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949. The first 2 were governing wounded and sick, the second in particular in the naval context, for shipwrecked as well. The 3rd convention deals with prisoners of war, and the 4th convention deals with the protection of civilians who find themselves in the hands of an opposing party. So vulnerable people across the board. The Geneva law is really about vulnerability of individuals who find themselves in the hands of the other party. There's a second body of that same, a second sub-body of that same law, which is sometimes called the Law of The Hague, and it governs the actual conduct of hostilities. So if I am a bomber pilot and I'm considering taking out a military objective, well, indeed, I do have to distinguish between my military objective and the surrounding civilian population. That's called distinction. And I have to bear in mind proportionality. But in fact, the laws of war, by virtue of a tacit understanding of military necessity, do allow you to, as that bomber pilot, to drop a bomb knowing that there will be civilian collateral damage, i.e. that civilians will die as a result of that attack quite lawfully. So this is the horror of war, but a reality of the law. Now, the entire body of international humanitarian law represents a balance between military necessity on one hand and humanity on the other. And it's a very difficult balance to strike, and it's what we've been talking about all of this week. So what are some of the key issues that we've been discussing? Well, we're mostly talking about weapons here. We know that under international law regarding weapons, that it is prohibited to create weapons which cause unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury. Those are the words that the law uses. Some of those have been codified into treaties like Chemical Weapons Convention, Biological Weapons Convention. But what about emerging technologies for which we have no precedent? That's where we have to look to the dictates of public conscience and start to ask questions about how it fits into the existing regime. But the regime is very practical. It's looking at simply protecting the civilian population and protecting those who are hors de combat, meaning soldiers who are wounded, for example, from the effects of hostilities. And we take that approach throughout. So if I had to make one point here, which is all I have time in the next 10 seconds, it would be that we have a good international legal framework governing the humanitarian considerations of warfare. The key is not to gut that framework by virtue of what is happening with new technologies, but to build on that and to interpret that body of law on that basis. And I think that's what my colleagues are going to be talking about next. So thank you very much.